Understand when the good brother said that we're technically or technology challenged. When we were growing up, there was no such thing as a computer. As a matter of fact, even in classroom, you couldn't have a calculator in there. And now they have cell phones and everything else in classrooms. And man, I don't know how they do it. But it's so good to be here. Glad to see everyone here. Appreciate the opportunity of being here tonight. It's good to have my wife Gerald with me, and my brother Jimmy, my sister Penny, and Jimmy's wife Sherry. They came to endure punishment, and I don't know, I like to walk sometimes. How far can I walk? Because I know it's being live, I think it's being live streamed. So I like to walk a little bit. But we're glad that they're here, and I'm glad to see you. I did graduate from Russellville High School in 1974. Now that's been quite a while ago, isn't it? I listened to Brother Gary's prayer rather closely tonight. I try to listen to him all the time real closely. But I remember hearing someone say years ago that you knew when you had transitioned from a young preacher to an old preacher. When you were a young preacher, that they would pray, or the individual would pray, Lord, give him a long life of service for you. But when you get to be older, they said, Lord, help him remember what he studied. Well, I need a lot of help to remember what I studied, because I have found over the last year or so that I'll go to start to do something, and I'll get there and I'll stop and say, now, what am I fixing to do? What am I looking for? Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one that's there. Before we get into the lesson, on a very personal note, I want to thank all of you for your many prayers over the last couple of years for me and my family. And I hope that I can get through part of this sermon or this lesson without being too emotional, because part of the leadership of Ezekiel deals with tragedy. But it's so good to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity that we have. But we are going to look at an unlikely example of leadership, and that it will be Ezekiel. There we go. And this is North Highlands, isn't it? And I say that jokingly because, where's Jackie Taylor? There he is over there. Jackie might remember this. A good friend of ours from years back was called to come and preach at Spring Valley when Jackie was at Spring Valley. Brother Hill Sparks called him. Well, he thought that it was Brother Bill Daniels from another congregation. He went to this other congregation. Spring Valley was sitting there waiting, looking around, seeing who was going to preach for him that Sunday. And this friend of ours, he got there and he went up, sat on the front seat. Well, it was Colbert Heights. Colbert Heights had just hired a new preacher. And he was sitting on the front pew and he was looking around, wondering if he had already been fired before he even started. Well, this friend of ours got up in the pulpit, and he was about a third of the way or halfway through the sermon before he realized he was in the wrong place. Now, strange things happen, don't they? But I don't know that I've ever had that happen to me before. The book of Ezekiel is an unusual book. It's one that most people don't study very often, because it is a book that is very complex and very complicated. It's a book that is oftentimes difficult to understand and to interpret. And yet it is a very important book, because it teaches us a number of things, including appropriate leadership. The book itself contains 48 chapters, 1,273 verses, and is classified as one of the major prophets of the Old Testament. Now, you may already know this, but the prophets were divided into major and minor prophets. And it's not due to the importance of the book, but rather to the volume or the content of the book. And so you have those that are major prophets and you have those that are minor prophets. But their message was still very relevant and very important. And so as we look at and consider the things of this, there's really nothing in the background of Ezekiel that we can know, other than the fact in Ezekiel chapter 1 and verse 3, the word of the Lord came expressly unto Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the river Shebar, and the hand of the Lord was there upon him. And so when you think about where that was at, and I don't know how well you can see this, but I put a map up there to show the captivity of Judah, and which was in 586 BC, several years ago, wasn't it? There were actually 3 deportations from Israel to Babylon. And as we mention those and we think about them, we think about some of the things that occurred, but the book of Ezekiel itself, as it's inspired of God, is a book of parables, visions, and signs. And because of that, many people simply do not study it. As a matter of fact, one writer said that concerning the book of Ezekiel, that some scenes are horrifying, with symbolic writing at times beyond comprehension. For these reasons, some early rabbis banned the book for anyone under the age of 30. Not only was the book of Ezekiel banned, but the book of Song of Solomon was also banned by many early rabbis because of its erotic nature. And so, through history, Ezekiel has been one that somehow gets overlooked. We think about Isaiah and Jeremiah. Well, as we'll see, Jeremiah and Daniel and Ezekiel were all contemporaries. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem. Daniel was in the palace of Babylon. And Ezekiel was by the riverside of Shebar. Now, it is estimated that that particular river, or where they were at, was about 100 miles south of Babylon, roughly between here and Birmingham. And so that distance would put them in a predicament and in a place where they couldn't have easy access. So one thing that we want to observe or mention first of all is the fact that no matter where you are, no matter what place you're at in life, you can be a leader. You don't have to be in a palace. You don't have to be in the presence of kings. You can be by the riverside. You can be wherever you are in life, and you can be a leader. Now, obviously, not everyone that is in leadership position should really be in leadership positions. Oftentimes in the workplace, and you may have observed this, but oftentimes in the workplace it's not what you know, but who you know that gets you into that position. And oftentimes you think, well, they'll grow into that leadership role. And sometimes they do, but in many cases they do not. But when we think about or look at the book of Ezekiel in itself, for just a moment, and trying to give some background information before we get to the heart of the matter, let me just mention 4 of the prominent parables that are mentioned or found in the book of Ezekiel. Parable of the 2 eagles in Ezekiel chapter 17. The parable of the 2 sisters in Ezekiel chapter 23. The parable of the boiling pot in Ezekiel chapter 24. The parable of the 2 sticks in Ezekiel chapter 37. Now, how many of us are familiar with any of those parables? Probably not many of us. But let me also mention 4 prominent visions. The first one is the vision of the cherubim. Now, there have been some in modern day that have tried to put a modern spin to this particular vision of Ezekiel. And what they have tried to say or suggest is that Ezekiel saw extraterrestrial people and spaceships. As a matter of fact, the books have been written on that. There was an individual who used to work for NASA at Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama, that read this particular book and decided that, well, I'm going to take some time off and I'm going to disprove this particular theory that Ezekiel saw spaceships. Well, he took some time off, and his conclusion after he did his research was that this man was right. That Ezekiel did see extraterrestrial beings, and he did see spaceships. Now, do I believe that? No. There's no evidence for that. What Ezekiel saw was relative to the people of God that were in captivity. Now let's think about, there's also the vision of glory and godliness, the vision of the burning vine, chapters 8 through 11, chapter 15, and the vision of the valley of dry bones in chapter 37. But there's some symbols that Ezekiel experienced. One of those was, and let me see, I may get ahead of my slides here. And I have to try to think, keep up with myself. The inability to speak. Now, can you imagine not being able to speak for an extended period of time? And husbands, don't look at your wives and say, oh, yes, please, Lord. Let that happen. Because you might need something and have to ask her for it, and she couldn't tell you where it was at. But then he was to lie upon his side. And the inability to speak was talking about the siege of Jerusalem. Lying up on his side was the duration of the exile. And then there was rationed food. How that food was rationed and you could only get a certain portion or a certain amount for a certain period of time. And then there was the vision of the knife and the razor. Now, it is estimated that Ezekiel was about 25 years old when he was carried into exile, and that he began his ministry at about the age of 30. There were 3 deportations. The first one occurred in 606 BC during the reign of Jehoiachin. Daniel was among those that were exiled during this first deportation. The second deportation was in 597 BC, during which Jehoiachin and his family were deported. Zedekiah was installed as king of Judah by Nebuchadnezzar, Jeremiah chapter 29. Ezekiel was among those during the second deportation. The third deportation occurred in 586 BC. During which time the temple was destroyed and Zedekiah was carried in chains to Babylon. Now let me give you just a little bit of background about Zedekiah. He was installed to become king of Judah, and he became king, and Jehoiachin had been carried to Babylon and imprisoned, and was imprisoned for about 30-something years. Zedekiah rebelled against Babylon. The king of Babylon came and took Zedekiah away in chains, but before he did, he put out his eyes. But before he put his eyes out, he killed all of his children in front of him. And he carried him away in chains, and he died as a prisoner of war. And so, when we think about the conflict We think about all the things that were going on. And in 586 BC would be some of the darkest hours of Ezekiel's life. Misery loves company. The siege of Jerusalem was one of those things that occurred. Now, when we think about the siege, we read about that, but we may not really comprehend everything that happened. When a siege was in place, the entire city was shut off. Nothing could come in, nothing could go out. There was no food, there was nothing there. And Jeremiah paints a very vivid but horrific illustration, or gives the example of that in Lamentations chapter 4 and verse 10, where he says that the mothers were actually boiling their children and eating their children. That it had gotten so bad that the hunger was so intense. And you can compare that with 2 Kings chapter 6, where Samaria was under siege. There was a famine there, and these two women made a pact with each other, and they said, we'll kill my son today and eat him, and we'll kill your son tomorrow and eat him. And they said, okay. Well, they killed the first child and ate him, and then the second woman had hid her child. And the king came by and saw, and she cried out to him. He said, what's wrong? And when she told him, he went and put sackcloth on and walked the walls of Jerusalem. There was nothing easy about what was happening in Israel and Judah at this time. When everything is going well and everything is going to plan or according to plan, leading is easier. Leading's never easy, but it's easier. But true leadership shines brightly in the midst of adversity. When things aren't going like they're supposed to, when no one else seems to really care, a true leader steps up and makes the difference. But one of the things that really troubled him was Ezekiel was the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple. Now, why would the destruction of the temple be concerning to him? Because he was of a priestly family. We ought to stop every once in a while and ask ourselves, if the church is comparable or comparable to the temple of old, how many of us would be bothered if the church doors were closed? How many of us would show any concern, or would it bother us? Would it make any difference to us? And sadly, I'm afraid that in many cases it might not, but it should. But the second thing that was really troubling was with Ezekiel was the death of his beloved wife. Now, I know that it hadn't been too long ago that, and I hope he doesn't mind me mentioning this, that Jackie lost Jacqueline. I haven't lost a spouse, but we did lose a child. And I can tell you that neither one of them would be easy. It's very difficult. But the instructions that God gave to Ezekiel are unfathomable to me. You cannot cry. You cannot shed a tear for your wife. How could you be a leader under those circumstances? And yet, Ezekiel stood up and he led that group of people that were by the river of Shebar. And tradition tells us that after a period of time, about 20-something years, that those very people that he were leading rose up against him and slew him because of his stand on principles and his condemnation of their actions, especially idolatry. But imagine that God would tell you that in the loss of a mate, the loss of a loved one, that you couldn't shed a tear, that you were assigned to the people of Israel. And then the purpose that we find that he does, that he writes and he dwells upon these things, was to dispel illusions, to denounce false prophets, to declare repentance, restoration, and renewal. You see, what was happening is that there were prophets there that saying, don't worry about it. This thing's not going to last long. It's going to be short-lived, and you'll be back home before you know it. And God told Ezekiel, this is what they're saying, but this is not what I said. They were there 70 years. 70 years of hardship, of challenge, of difficulty. And here was Ezekiel, whose main purpose was to bring them back to God, because all the sins that they had committed, the things that they were doing at home, many of them they brought with them. And he catalogs those sins. And I think I have a slide that lists all of those. But someone said that like a giant, Ezekiel wrestled against Jewish degeneracy and Babylonian pride. And he was spelled with the idea of doing away with the idea of a speedy return. The clear and concise message of the book and of Ezekiel and of his leadership is to enhance the faithfulness of the Jewish people while they were in captivity. Do we not need, even today, encouragement to be faithful? Because it's so easy to become distracted. It's so easy to lose our way and to fall by the wayside. And if we're not careful, we can fall by the wayside and nobody notices. We need to be encouraged to be faithful to God through thick and thin, through hardship, difficulty, challenges, and in the good times as well. And that's hard. But God never said that it would be easy. He cataloged the many transgressions which they had committed, and I'm going to go through these rather quickly because I don't know what time I'm supposed to quit. Somebody told me 3 hours. Did they tell me wrong? Was it 5 hours instead of 3? Somebody will tell me when to quit, won't it? What time? 7:30. Okay, I still got 20 minutes. All right. 20 minutes according to my clock. Well, I don't have one. All right, but some of the catalog of sins that he gave was rebellion, stiff-heartedness, abuse of privileges, idolatry, failure to follow thus saith the Lord, spiritual adultery. Now, they knew what physical adultery was because they knew what the 10 Commandments were. And did you know that the first 4 of those 10 Commandments deals with man's relationship to God, and the other 6 deal with man's relationship with man? Isn't that amazing? That God placed a lot of emphasis on how we are to deal with one another. How tragic it is that we don't always follow those things, though. Denial of individual responsibility, prayers amiss, a variation of sins, undiscerning, pride, hearing but not doing, and shepherds that were corrupt. Leaders that were more interested in themselves than they were in the people that were following them. Does this not sound almost like today's society and today's culture? It does in a lot of ways, doesn't it? But he was to emphasize that salvation is a personal responsibility. That though it was collective and he was addressing them as a nation, their own relationship with God was solely dependent upon their response to God. And so it is with us. Our relationship with God is dependent upon how we respond to God's instructions, to God's words, to God's message to us. Now, he emphasized that, and he emphasized something more than once. Do you know, I've said and I've often believed that the mother of all learning is repetition. You learn something by doing what? Repeating it over and over and over again till it becomes second nature. Well, Ezekiel didn't repeat something twice. He repeated it 4 times. In Ezekiel chapter 6 and verse 7, verse 10, verse 13, and verse 14, he said, "Ye shall know that I am the Lord." What a message. But it didn't sink in. Because they went about doing the same thing that they had been doing all the while. And he gives them visions. When you think about the vision of the valley of dry bones in Ezekiel 37, it's a picture of Judah, and those dry bones come back to life. And God is telling them that I will leave or have a remnant that will come back home, but all of them didn't come. All of them weren't allowed to return. And there were some that actually stayed in Babylon of their own choice. When the people started coming back. Let's think about just a few minutes some aspects of a prophet's life with present-day application. Number one, he was an exile. What does it mean to be an exile? Away from his home country, in a strange and foreign land. But aren't we exiles as well? Are we not called to be separate from the world? Are we not called to make a difference and to be separated and apart from the world? Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, and I'm not going to try to quote or read all or look at all these passages because I know our time won't allow us to do that. These all died in faith, not having received the promise, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Paul, in writing to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 17, said, "Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you." Come out from among them. Come out from among whom? Come out from among those of the world. You see, Peter says that we're a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people, that we should show forth the praises of him who hath called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. Ezekiel was in exile, but so are we. Secondly, he was an ambassador. Now, what is an ambassador? A diplomat. One who speaks on behalf of the other. We have in this country those that are ambassadors to the nations, to various nations, and what they say conveys the idea and the principles of the political party that's in power. They represent us. Well, as ambassadors, Ezekiel represented God. And as ambassadors, you and I represent God. And we represent Christ. And the world should see Christ in us. It should see more of Christ in us than it does the world in us. But does it? We sing about being more like Christ. More love to thee, O Christ. More love to thee, O God. But how many of us walk out and engage in the same things that we've been doing apart from God? In Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 20, for which I am an ambassador in bonds, that therein I may speak boldly as I ought to speak. Then thirdly, he was a watchman. And so are we. We're to watch not only for our own souls, but we're to watch for the souls of others. Isn't that what a leader does? Isn't that what the elders of the church and the deacons of the church and the minister of the church, isn't that part of their responsibility, the elders in particular? You know, I've told the folks at Littleville, my job is not to make you feel good. My job and my responsibility is to try to help you get to heaven and to try to help myself get there as a watchman. Now, a watchman doesn't close his eyes. How effective would a watchman be if they were watching manufacturing, or they were watching even this building tonight and they were sitting out there asleep? How effective would they be? A watchman is attentive, and they're watching, paying attention. They know all the details of what's going on. And then we see that he was a sign. So are we. When we think about being a sign, we think about being an example. We think about letting our light shine that others may see our good works and glorify the Father which is in heaven. We're a sign to those around us. We're the only Bible that some people will read, the only church that they observe. If we go out into the world and we conduct ourselves in a worldly manner, and they stop and they look and say, boy, he's supposed to be a Christian? What kind of example is that? Jesus said, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven. Are we that kind of a sign? That we might be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse generation. But now, right quickly, let me give you a few other points about the leadership of Ezekiel. Attributes of his leadership. What makes him an unusual leader? What makes him a leader that you and I should look to as guidance? Number one, he was a man who saw the glory of God. He understood what it was and what it meant to be in the presence of the Almighty. He understood that there was a higher power and that God's will would be done. He was a man who recognized his own imperfections. A leader is not always right. Now, there may always be a leader, but a leader makes mistakes. I've been a leader in the church for a number of years. Not only as a preacher for about 50 years, but I also served a number of years as one of the elders of the church. And I can tell you, I made my mistakes. And every elder will tell you that they've made mistakes. If they're doing their job, if they're doing what they're supposed to do, they're going to make mistakes. We recognize our own imperfections. We recognize that we are not all in all. God said that I am, and that's not you and I, is it? So one key component to good leadership is realizing that we do not have all the answers, and that we ourselves are an imperfect individual who is under the authority of a higher being. Thirdly, he was a man who was able to be touched by the needs of others. A leader understands and has compassion on other people. I can remember years back, and I went to a number of leadership training sessions over my career. And I was not only a leader in the church, but I was a leader in manufacturing as well. And I remember going to one of the first sessions that I ever went to, a lady by the name of Mildred Ramsey. I don't know if you ever heard of Mildred Ramsey or not, but she was in the textile industry. And she had written a book, The Supervisor. Well, in that particular book, she says the supervisor should not have any interaction with his employees outside of the workplace. You don't know them. You don't invite them to your house. You don't go to their house. You don't go to dinner together. You don't fish together. You don't do nothing. Well, things changed. Then there was another individual that wrote a book, was called The Toy Box Leadership. And I had that book at home, and I loaned both those two books out to someone, and I didn't get them back. But The Toy Box Leadership, they took these toys and they illustrated how leaders should be and the interaction that you should have. And then after that, John Maxwell. I don't know if anybody's familiar with John Maxwell. He's one of the leading leadership gurus of today. Written numbers of books and has some great ideas. But the concept was that to begin with, you didn't have anything to do with your employees. Now it is that you get to know your employees. You know who they are. And I can remember reading about a CEO that walked through and they said, "What is the first thing you do?" He said, "I learned everyone's name, including the service people who don't work here regular but come in and service. I know their name. I know their children's name. I know their birthdays. I know everything about them." And they said, "Why?" He said, "Because it makes them important. It shows that I have compassion for them. I know their needs, and they will respond more favorably than they will if I act like I don't know them." Isn't that something that would work in the church too? You better believe it will. I can remember several years ago, one of the elders at Leeton, when I was preaching at Leeton, had visited a congregation, and I won't call the name of the congregation, but he came back and he said, "Preacher," he said, and it was in the wintertime, he said, "It was colder inside that church building than it was outside." He said, "Not a single person spoke to me. Not a single person even recognized that I was there." You know, a good leader is a man that was able to be touched by the needs of others. He was a man who was willing to give of himself to the task at hand. It wasn't a matter of delegating something, although there are times when you must delegate because one person can't do everything that needs to be done. But he was involved. As leaders, we have to be involved in what's going on. You can't lead if you're outside somewhere else doing something else. And I know we've all heard the illustration of the man that was sitting on the side of the road, and here come a man running through and stopped and said, "Sir, did you see a group of people pass by here just a few minutes ago?" And he said, "Yeah, they passed by about 10 minutes ago. Why?" He said, "Because I'm their leader." Well, now what kind of leading was he doing? Leadership becomes involved. Elders need to know, deacons need to know, preachers need to know what's going on. Am I right? And then he was a man of consolation and comfort to the penitent. When someone repented and turned their life around, He had compassion. He had comfort. He expressed consolation. He wasn't one of these that would stand back and say, well, I see where old brother so-and-so repented today. Wonder how long that'll last. You know, he just repented 3 months ago. I don't know if he'll last 3 months this time. Does it matter how many times? No. We need to encourage and strengthen that brother or that sister, understanding their weaknesses. Because it could be us. It could be us. Do we not need to be reminded of what Ezekiel and the other prophets of God reminded and warned the people of their day about? Yes, we do. Sadly, such may not always be the case. We may bypass them or pass them by and never mention eternal things, never mention the tragedy of a lost soul. The psalmist gives a good conclusion to the problems that happened in Babylon. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. For there they had carried us away captive, required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy, remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewardeth thee as thou hast saved us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones. As he lamented, even the psalmist understood the problems that occurred in Babylon and the great leadership of Ezekiel. Pray tonight that as we conclude, maybe we've said something that will encourage you or inspire you. You're not a Christian. We want you to be one. You've obeyed the gospel, but you've not been faithful, and God knows you haven't been, and you know you haven't been, and other people know it as well. Would you hear the message of Ezekiel tonight? To know that I am the Lord, and the Lord is reaching out to you as we stand together and as we sing.